You're listening to No Plot, Only Lore, a podcast about games and the tables we play them at. Your DMs tonight and every night are Josh and Chris. You can find us on all podcast platforms or check us out at noplotonlylore.com. If you like what you hear today, please rate and review the show and share it with everyone you've ever met. Welcome back to No Plot, Only Lore, a show supposedly about D&D that continues to devolve into me arguing about Star Wars.
Every single week. Yeah.
It's space fantasy.
I'm going to have to change the branding. I'm going to have to put lightsabers on the website. One of our top performing videos on YouTube has a thumbnail that has a lightsaber in it. And I think that's a sign.
Yeah, it is a sign from the Midi-chlorians.
So this is a continuation of last week's. Yeah.
So we wanted to keep going on this idea of more lore not being good, which is probably the easiest argument I will ever make. Star Wars caught me young. I remember I wrote a book report / I don't know, we'll call it a novelization of some sort in the fourth grade. About Star Wars. And I called them lightsabers, and
I thought they were lifesavers for the longest time. Like I was really confused why the candies were round.
Yeah.
I thought they were lightsabers.
It got me good, and I've never looked back. A large portion of my life right now is dedicated to Star Wars as a card game, this show every other week somehow devolves into me defending George Lucas's shitty magnum opus.
Part of that comes down to me being incredibly irreverent about Star Wars. Despite the fact that this is a series that I do love, right? I do have a very strong attachment to a lot of Star Wars. I have so little affection for the extended universe stuff that whenever that starts to bleed into the conversation, I start turning into a bit of a dickbag.
I've noticed. And that's where we really initially diverge. I didn't read a ton of the novelizations, but I read enough that I appreciated what some authors added. And obviously now we're seeing some of that effort being rewarded by being added into official canon and stuff, there was the semi-official stuff where, where Admiral Thrawn was added, when they first started adding him in the Clone Wars cartoon stuff. Now he's officially in Ahsoka, and Star Wars has been sort of officially merged into one canon, as opposed to different tiers of canon. So it's nice.
Sort of?
Yeah.
But that's still kind of confusing because they did that canon reset.
Yeah.
Right? They decided to do that canon reset, and then they were like, okay, this is the stuff that isn't canon. And then they've been slowly reintroducing stuff from that to the canon. Right.
Well, but what I mean is that you had this problem before where there was movie canon, and then there was comics and books and TV shows, and now Disney's official position is that if it's an official Disney show, it's canon, right? And right. The movies don't supersede anything we do on TV.
Right. No, that's fair. I think one of the other big differences between the way that we approach Star Wars is I have never read a Star Wars.
Right. And that's too bad. Because you're really
not. Yeah, I'm big into reading. I love reading.
Well, and there's so much there for you. I mean, whether it's the New Jedi stuff, the Heir to the Empire stuff with Thrawn, the stuff about Luke's Mara Jade romance and the Solo kids, The stuff that Karen Travis wrote, especially with regards to like Mandalorians, which is always really interesting. Like there's I can understand why they wanted to differentiate some of the canon tiers, because there is like so much there that was experimental. Like they really did let them try out cool things.
Well, and contradictory too, right? Because you had writers who were writing books simultaneously that weren't consulting with one another, and they were contradicting one another on facts. And so you had to be like, okay, well, which one of these are we going to go with? Whichever one is closest to the movies, I guess. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Which is like, I appreciate that they gave people the flexibility to be wrong, you know?
And they were so often.
Yeah. Yeah. There's been a lot of wonkiness. You, in particular, mentioned a few things that had like managed to trickle down even to your limited expanded universe knowledge.
Well, yeah. And I mean, I did do a quick Google search for the worst things that have ever happened in the Star Wars expanded universe. So we're going to touch on some of those.
Yeah.
Because, again, when you've got a whole lot of people putting together one thing, it gets messy. And I think this is actually kind of the opposite problem that we were looking at with Coheed and Cambria, where Coheed and Cambria is Claudio Sanchez's brain baby.
Right.
Like everything that's happening in there is something that he created. And so much of his personality, so much of his history, so much of his way of viewing the world is going to be infused in that in the way that it is with any auteur.
Right.
But for Star Wars, you just got a stew pot, right? Like you've got so many people who are putting stuff into this universe, and it is a mix.
So it's funny that you phrase it like that, because I think Star Wars actually wound up with both problems, where he made the original trilogy, and frankly, he really only made one of the movies, right? Like better people than he put together, Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. You can see
he being George Lucas.
Yes.
For clarity.
Sorry, yeah. And then you can see that like the writing got away from him a little bit in the two subsequent movies for, I think, a good reason. And then they started letting a bunch of people try it, and then it really got out of hand. And so then the prequels came out, and he tried to wrestle it back under his vision, right?
Right.
And that's where I think it got some of its wonkiest, because it started getting to be like officially wonky. Like we mentioned, Midi-chlorians and Jedi are now like, Jedi are now
ascetic monks.
Ascetic warrior monks,
That's such a strange choice.
He had this like, I'm gonna call it like a mission to clarify a lot of stuff that didn't need clarifying.
We don't need to know where the Force comes from.
No,
we super don't.
Truly don't. like I said before, the mystery behind the Force is one of its strongest points, because then it could be anything, right? It could even be a boat.
Even just the name. Like the name is very evocative. I have spent a stupid amount of time trying to think of a better name for a magic system than the Force.
Right.
And I don't think there is one.
No, because one, like, it's very clearly understood what it is almost immediately. Our universe is full of forces, and this is like the penultimate force. Like, this is the Force. And then it's also...
The only thing that I think has come even close is Robert Jordan's The One Power.
Sure.
Right, The One Power, very evocative, similar way, that comes from the Source.
Right.
Which, evokes the Force already.
Yeah.
So, but that I think is the only thing that has ever come even a little bit close in magic systems to
I think you're right.
Of just, like, evocation.
Yeah, and so, like, you get an idea of, like, roughly what it is and what it can do without it being like explained in such detail that it leaves no room for imagination. And that, I think, is a theme that we're going to come back to again and again when we're talking about like too much lore, is that it sucks imagination out of your world and out of your readers or participants' minds by just like over explaining things. Because then the problem with over explaining things and getting too into the weeds and too specific is that once you do that, once you start establishing hard and fast rules, then things have to obey rules. And you get a dissonance that happens when, something doesn't fit into that rigid rule set. If your rule set's loosey-goosey and your rules of your universe are just kind of like magic can happen, then you're never like in trouble for doing it kind of wrong,
Brandon Sanderson talks about this quite a bit. He recently put out a new series of videos. He does lectures at Brigham Young University.
Yeah.
Like not every year, but I think it's like every couple of years he ends up doing like a course there. And then the whole thing goes online so you can watch it. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that he kind of comes back to quite a bit is that like when you're looking at the rules for your magic system, you are allowed to break those rules as long as you've established like a good reason for that prior to the breaking of the rules.
Right.
Right. Like you can set up a way that you can break the rules as long as the rule has been set and the expectation has been set that this is something that might live a little bit outside of those.
Right.
And then the rules themselves have to exist to reinforce your story.
Right.
Right. Like, again, going back to Robert Jordan, the fact that the one power cannot raise the dead.
Yeah.
Right. Is a hard and fast rule. And I actually honestly expected that to be broken.
Yeah.
By the end of the series. Like the direction that Nynaeve's character was going in strongly suggested to me that she was going to figure out a way to cure death.
Yeah.
Never did.
Yep.
She found a way to kind of skirt around it, I guess. Spoiler alert for a series that's been done for 15 years.
That started 100 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, but never actually broke the rule. So like if you have those rules, then not only do you need to follow those rules, but those rules have to be reinforced by the story itself.
Yes.
And they have to inform the story, and the more information that you have coming into the story, the less flexibility you have in the telling of that story.
Yeah. And I think it's like super, super handy to have the ability to break a rule for sure, for like narrative purposes. But again, the impact of breaking that rule is like the reason to break the rule, right? Like you don't just break it because you haven't defined it. You break it because you need to further some other element.
Well, and then especially in a shared universe like Star Wars, now that rule is broken for everyone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So if there is a way to break that rule, now you have to recontextualize that rule within the universe itself.
Yeah.
And that means that anybody can do it. And if anybody can do it, what are the repercussions of that?
Right. Right. The second you allow one person to do it, then, okay, everyone can do this. And then if anyone can do this, why haven't they been doing it from the start?
Yeah. If Nynaeve can raise the dead and she doesn't, she's a dick.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there has to be a good reason for her not to be able to do that if she's able to do it even once.
Yeah.
Right. So no, that absolutely makes sense. And I think that like specificity can be a good thing.
Yeah.
When it's in service to your story.
Yeah.
When it's in service to your characters and when it's in service to like creating good and impactful moments. But again, when you're dealing with such a huge shared world like Star Wars, as soon as Luke Skywalker can, like, I don't know, beat somebody to death with a planet?
Yeah.
You've changed the scale.
Yeah.
So,
and so this comes up to the thing I mentioned earlier. One of the characters that I find most annoying as an introduction to this whole thing is Vader's secret apprentice, Starkiller, because they spend the entire series telling you just how incredible this guy is for like really no good reason. And then you see him pull a Star Destroyer out of the sky, and you're like, wait, he can do that, but Yoda could barely move an X-Wing? What is happening?
Right.
And then it's like, well, if he can do it, he's not even like the chosen one for this universe. Why didn't Vader ever do that? Why didn't Luke do that? You know, why didn't Mace do that? One of the most powerful Force users of all time. Like, why did they...
Imagine if they went back and they made that the scale the whole time, though.
Right.
Right? Like, how different would the original trilogy be?
It would be hilarious.
Yeah. Like, Yoda shows up and he just, like, beats some people to death with buildings.
Yeah.
Just picks the whole fucking building up, smashes them into a person until that person is a bloody pulp.
Oh, the whole Separatist rebellion is just, like, completely nullified by the fact that Yoda can take their dropships and beat their army to death with them.
Not even Yoda. You have 2 Jedi on the planet.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you've got Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon on the planet of Naboo. They just push all the droids back into their ships. Yeah. Because that's the scale that we're working with. And then they push those ships into the sun.
Yeah. No, 100%. 100%. Like, there was no reason for them to go and negotiate any sort of agreement. They're just like, I'm going to put your droids back up your own asshole, and then I'm leaving.
Again, though, imagine how different the series would be if that were the case, though.
Right.
Right? Like, if the Jedi are the nuclear deterrent.
Yeah.
Right? That changes the whole... I kind of want to write this now.
Yeah, it's the walking, talking super weapons that are also weird religious monks.
Yeah. Well, no, I would turn them into, like, samurai
right.
musketeers. But, yeah. Because that's what they should have been in the first place. But,
yeah.
Anyway.
At any rate, yeah. So, I mean, let's see. Things that talking too much about it has ruined for Star Wars. The Force.
Boba Fett.
Oh, we're going to divert for a second to talk about Boba Fett. Boba Fett was cool because he was mysterious, and then someone got it in their minds that, like, we need more of the character that everyone loves, and so they brought him back from the dead and then made him like a weenie. I don't understand the instinct.
And then he went and found some Power Rangers flavored young toughs to be his motorcycle gang on mobility scooters.
Yep. No, the entire Book of Fett was a disaster. But it didn't have to be. But again, it's talking about the thing too much makes it not cool. Like, his lack of lines and the fact that he, like, died in such this, like, inglorious way was, like, part of what made the character great. And then they're like, but money. What if we had money?
See, if I were going to do that, if I were going to do a Book of Boba Fett, I would probably just bring it back to, like, first couple of episodes, The Mandalorian, where you're flying to a planet doing a job, and then do it like Monster of the Week, Job of the Week, right? Keep it very serial. Sorry, not serial, but very like, what did they call that shit? When you had like a series that needed to be able to syndication. Keep it very like syndication.
Oh
style.
yeah.
It always goes back to your like your status quo. You don't have to worry about like huge amounts of plot development. Every once in a while you'll get like a plot development episode, but most of it is just going to be like he shows up on a planet, he's got to take somebody in. Here's the stuff that stands in the way between him and taking that person in.
Sure. I can get down with that.
Right? That would have been fine. That would have been fine. That would have been like you could do the first couple of episodes of him like escaping the Sarlacc pit or whatever.
Yeah.
And then first of all, get the fuck off of Tatooine.
Oh, so fast. Get far away from Tatooine.
That planet needs to burn in hell.
I understand for like the draw of like, oh man, remember Luke Skywalker? But like get away. Get away.
Yep. Get away.
It's a desert wasteland for a reason. Stop setting your show in the least interesting places possible. Like, the thing that was great about... I didn't love The Mandalorian Season 3, but like all the time that they spent on Coruscant, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That place is interesting as hell, and it's super developed. The fact that like the only part of the actual planet surface left is this little like pebble in the middle of town, and then you realize like, oh, that's like the top of a massive mountain, is awesome.
Yep. And like, imagine a bounty hunter procedural in Coruscant.
Imagine.
Right? That would be a great show. I'd watch the shit out of that.
Yeah. Yeah, like, talk about your unexplored great areas. As like, Coruscant, bounty hunters, underworld stuff. Like, even the little bit that they got where it's like, oh, you realize, like, this weird sect of Mandalorians is hiding underground and is hidden in, like, sewer systems. Right? Like, guess what Coruscant is probably full of? Seedy underground sewer systems.
Mm-hmm. And a bunch of, like, fucking weirdos who are taking advantage of people in weird places and for weird reasons.
Yeah, but no, let's go back to the bright desert with nothing going on but moisture farming.
And the people with the sticks that do the fighting.
Have the weird Tusken faces. Raiders.
The Tusken Raiders, those guys.
Like, they introduced the Pikes, who are... There's tons of potential there for a cool antagonist, but then you put the Pikes in a terrible, terrible setting, and yeah, they're boring.
Well, and they also introduced, like, the dust trade.
Yep.
And was it dust or spice? Spice trade.
Spice.
And you can't tread too terribly heavy on the toes of Dune.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, using spice as a drug in Coruscant would be fucking great.
Yeah.
Now you have, like, the police in Coruscant can't, like, deal with this on their level, so they go to bounty hunters to try and, like, even the playing field. Get Boba Fett somehow emotionally invested in that, in, like, some of his contacts from back in his bounty hunting days, and you got a fucking show.
Yeah. It like, I don't love this phrase, but it does just kind of write itself.
And then, like, they wrote it in the weirdest direction possible.
Yes. They wrote it away from everything that is, like, easily done. I don't know if
we just want to rebuild Jabba's, like, palace. That's all we want. We just want to rebuild Jabba's palace and have Boba Fett sit in the chair.
I understand the urge to, like, have that cool moment of, like, this is the daimyo, but also, like, why did you have to call him a daimyo? Like, never mind. It's
yeah,
it's dumb. It's needlessly dumb, and it's frustrating that, like, it comes from a place of, like, squandered opportunity, you know?
Speaking of the Fets, do you remember the Fett Jedi?
The Fett Jedi is, like, the coolest fucking thing they ever did. It's so dumb, but, like, I love it. Yeah, sorry, the Hutt Jedi.
Yeah.
Just the idea of this gargantuan idiot space slug who also, like, could be insanely nimble is very funny to me.
I mean, that's funny, but, like, again, that kind of comes back to my whole thing about, like, Yoda's fight style.
Right.
Like, if I was a giant space slug, my fight style would be the Force.
Yeah, it has to be. Your arms aren't long enough to be a swordsman.
No, I would stab myself much more often than I would stab my opponents.
Yeah, and not, like, by a little margin, by, like, a lot.
No. Yeah, so, like, having independent lightsabers swinging around me doing my bidding would be my fighting style of choice for that. I wouldn't be doing a lot of jumping around or flipping or anything like that.
No. And see, that's like, they I don't want to say they ruined Yoda, but they did diminish Yoda by, you know, part of Yoda's strength was his mystery, right? And that moment when this, like, weirdo little troll suddenly pulls an X-Wing out of the goddamn swamp, and you're like, what is happening? Who is this guy actually? There's a whole other story to him that we don't know. How powerful is he? Gets completely ripped away when they're like, yeah, also, like he fights like a gerbil on fucking ad. Like it's so dumb.
Also, he was a general and a master in the council.
Yes.
And like, if I was going to pick a role for Yoda in the like prequel trilogy, he would have just been the youngling's teacher.
Right.
Right. Like he would have taught new Jedi how to use the Force. That would have been his main role. And I still would have had him fight Palpatine.
Yeah.
But not as a flying around Kermit the Frog floppy puppet.
No.
Just, again,
yeah,
2 lightsabers swinging around him in unison, utilizing the Force in other ways while he's doing that.
Yeah. Well, and
just to show off like how flexible he is with the Force, how like masterful his use of the Force is, how accurate his use of the Force is.
Yeah, I was going to say the other thing that would have been a nice juxtaposition is like when Mace went to confront Palpatine, you saw what should have been 3 top tier generals get cut down, right? And they went in with fairly traditional saber styles, right? Kit Fisto was no slouch when it came to lightsaber combat. And he died almost instantly. So seeing Yoda then, like, it's not just like, oh, by the way, he's also an excellent swordsman. It's like, no, he uses a type of fighting that, 1, suits his character, and 2, allows him to take on a traditional swordsman with unorthodox techniques and just, further enhances the lore of this ultra powerful little green goober.
Yep. It was, I was in a theater when I saw that moment for the first time, and I will admit that there was cheering in the theater when Yoda threw down.
There's always cheering for dumb shit from dumb people, right? Like, there's people who don't love Star Wars as much as I love Star Wars, and they want to sit there and, they just want to be, like, obviously at the end of the day, we all want to be entertained, but they just want to be, like, dazzled by neat moments. And they don't consider the broader effects of those neat moments on, the universe as a whole. As a semi-living thing.
Speaking of neat moments, you remember that time that Luke Skywalker turned to the dark side and then the Emperor's ghost took over his body?
Okay, so there are independent parts of that storyline that, like, have potential. Right? Yes. The idea that, like, maybe Luke could be ultimately corrupted through, like, frustration or whatever it, happened to be. But the idea that, like, and they keep going back to this even in, like, the sequel trilogy, that, like, somehow this one guy, the Emperor, is just like the uber Sith, and no one can ever, hope to compete with his machinations. It's just so infuriating because it discounts other great Sith characters like Darth Revan and Darth Plagueis, and they allude to them in other media, and they're just unimportant, right? Because again, it's always just comes back to like, well, but the Emperor, the bestest Sith, who lives forever and somehow returns at the most inconvenient times, is just so, like, short-sighted from a story perspective.
One of the things that I always thought was interesting, and like the only thing that made me almost crack open a Star Wars Expanded Universe book was descriptions that I'd heard about the fall of Jacen Solo.
Right.
Where Jacen didn't just jump into the dark side because it seemed like fun and like the better, more powerful version of the Force, but because he was continually presented situations where the dark side answer seemed like the right one.
Right.
And every time he made one of those decisions, he was one step closer to normalizing that, and that being the way that he does things and becoming a dark side user.
Right. Well, I mean, that was the big, like, you know, tragedy of Anakin Skywalker, was that, like, his turn to the dark side was not out of, like, a lust for power or greed or whatever. It was, like, fear and, like, you know, wanting to save someone he loved. Like, it was good storytelling because it was relatable and understandable.
It was bad storytelling because the writing was bad.
The writing was bad, but the idea was there. You know, like, you can't.
And I mean, you can deconstruct it where, like, he's just lost his mother violently and took violent action against the people that hurt her. And now he is in a position where the only other person who has had a position of that much import in his life is going to be taken from him violently. And the only options that he has to fix that are to follow the weird old guy who tells him strange stories in the opera house.
Yeah.
So, like,
hey, you have a problem. I have a solution. It's the only solution. No one else will tell you the truth. Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. And
again, said to a child who has spent his entire life being brainwashed.
And before that, being a literal slave.
Yeah.
No,
do you think maybe he's got some daddy issues?
It follows. Like, I see where that plot line comes from and could be very interesting. It was just written so poorly that it's really hard to try and, like, sift that out of I don't like sand.
It's coarse.
Hey, thanks for making it all the way through this episode of No Plot Only Lore. If you're looking for more, you can always find us at noplotonlylore.com and on all the very best podcast platforms. If you like what you heard today, please share, rate, and review the show to feed my never-ending need for attention and validation.